The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his father, Prince William. The young prince wore his school uniform, a simple navy blazer and gray trousers, looking remarkably ordinary for someone who would one day wear the crown. His small hand gripped a worn teddy bear that had been his companion since he was 3 years old. The castle was unusually quiet that morning. Staff members moved with hushed footsteps, their usual cheerful greetings replaced by solemn nods. Even the birds seemed to sense the gravity of the day, their songs muted against the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of both joy and sorrow. Guard Captain James Morrison stood at attention near the main entrance, his red uniform pristine, as always. At 62, he had served the royal family for over 4 decades. His weathered hands held steady despite the tremor that had begun to affect him in recent months. Today was his final day of service, though few knew the real reason behind his sudden retirement. 3 weeks earlier, Captain Morrison had received news that would change everything. The doctors had been direct but gentle in their delivery. The symptoms he had been ignoring, the occasional dizziness, the fatigue that seemed to grow stronger each day, the way his hands sometimes shook when he thought no one was looking, all pointed to one conclusion. Early-onset Parkinson's disease had begun its quiet invasion of his body. The diagnosis hit him like a physical blow. For a man whose entire identity was built around strength, precision, and unwavering service, the idea of his body betraying him was almost unbearable. He had spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how to tell his wife Margaret, how to explain to his grandchildren why Grandpa's hands were starting to shake. But it was the thought of disappointing the royal family that tormented him most. These weren't just his employers. They were people he had protected, served, and grown to deeply respect over the decades. He had been present for Prince William's wedding, had stood guard during the births of all 3 royal children, and had shared in countless moments of both celebration and sorrow. The decision to retire early had been the hardest of his life. He could have hidden the diagnosis for a while longer, but his conscience wouldn't allow it. The royal family deserved better than a guard who might falter at a crucial moment. So he had requested a private meeting with the palace administrators, submitted his resignation, and prepared for his final day of service. Prince George had noticed Captain Morrison during their recent visits to Windsor. The boy had always been observant, perhaps more so than adults realized. He watched the way the guard's shoulders had become slightly less square, how his usually perfect posture sometimes wavered when he thought no one was looking. The young prince had even asked his father about it during a car ride the previous week. "Why does Captain Morrison look sad, Papa?" George had asked, his innocent eyes reflecting genuine concern. Prince William had paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups go through difficult times, George. Captain Morrison has been very loyal to our family for many years. He's a good man." The answer had satisfied George's curiosity temporarily, but the boy continued to think about the guard who had always greeted him with such warmth and respect. There was something about Captain Morrison that reminded George of his own grandfather, a gentle strength that made him feel safe and protected. As they approached the main entrance that morning, Prince George noticed Captain Morrison standing even straighter than usual, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of his surroundings. The guard's eyes swept across the familiar courtyard, taking in the ancient stones, the perfectly manicured gardens, and the flag flying proudly overhead. Margaret Morrison had been awake since dawn, carefully pressing her husband's uniform one final time. She had done this ritual thousands of times over their 40-year marriage, but today felt different. Her hands moved slowly over the red fabric, smoothing out creases that weren't really there, delaying the moment when she would have to let him go. She had wanted to accompany him to work, to be there for this significant moment, but James had gently refused. This was something he needed to do alone, he had explained. It was his goodbye to a life that had given him purpose and meaning for so many years. The couple had met when James was a young guardsman, fresh-faced and eager to serve. Margaret had been working as a seamstress in a shop near the barracks, and their romance had blossomed over shared cups of tea and long walks through London's parks. She had supported him through every promotion, every challenging assignment, every moment of doubt. Now, as she watched him prepare for his final day, she saw both the young man she had fallen in love with and the distinguished officer he had become. The diagnosis had been devastating for both of them, but they had made a pact to face it together, to find new purposes and new joys in whatever time they had left. Captain Morrison arrived at the castle earlier than necessary, as was his habit. He walked slowly through the corridors he knew by heart, stopping to speak with colleagues who had become friends over the decades. Many of them knew this was his last day, though few knew the real reason behind his departure. The younger guards looked up to him with respect and affection. He had mentored many of them, sharing not just the practical skills of their profession, but the deeper understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and dignity. Several had asked to organize a farewell ceremony, but Morrison had politely declined. He preferred quiet goodbyes to grand gestures. As he took his position that morning, Morrison felt the weight of all those years settling on his shoulders. He thought about the changes he had witnessed, the way the royal family had evolved and adapted to a changing world while maintaining their essential dignity and purpose. He had been privileged to see them not just as symbols, but as human beings dealing with the same joys and struggles that touched everyone's lives. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his reverie. Prince William and Prince George were walking toward him, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation. Morrison straightened his shoulders and prepared to greet them with the same professionalism he had maintained throughout his career, even as his heart acknowledged that this would be one of the last times he would perform this simple but meaningful duty. The morning light caught the brass buttons on his uniform, making them gleam like small suns against the red fabric. For a moment, he felt like the young guardsman he had once been, proud and strong and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The tremor in his hands had quieted, as if his body understood the significance of this moment and had granted him a few more hours of the steadiness that had defined his service. Prince George looked up at Captain Morrison with those thoughtful eyes that seemed to see more than most people realized. There was something in the boy's expression that made the guard pause, a depth of understanding that was both surprising and touching. In that moment, Morrison realized that this goodbye might be more meaningful than he had anticipated, and that sometimes the most profound gestures come from the most unexpected sources. Prince George stopped walking when they reached Captain Morrison. Something in the guard's posture, the way he held himself with such careful dignity, made the young prince pause and really look at the man who had been a constant presence in his life at Windsor Castle. "Good morning, Captain Morrison," Prince William said with his usual warmth, extending his hand for the traditional handshake they had shared countless times before. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, his voice steady despite the emotion he was fighting to contain. He shook the prince's hand firmly, then turned to George with a gentle smile. "And good morning to you, Prince George." But instead of the usual polite greeting, George tilted his head slightly, studying the guard's face with an intensity that made both men pause. The boy's eyes, so much like his late grandmother Princess Diana's, seemed to see straight through to the sadness that Morrison was trying so hard to hide. "Captain Morrison," George said quietly, "are you feeling all right? You look different today." The question caught both adults off guard. Prince William glanced at his son with surprise, while Morrison felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack slightly. How had this child noticed what others had missed? "I'm quite well. Thank you for asking, Prince George," Morrison replied, but his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. George continued to study him, then did something completely unexpected. He stepped closer to the guard, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his beloved teddy bear. The small brown bear was worn soft from years of hugging, its fur faded but its button eyes still bright. "This is Mr. Paddington," George said solemnly, holding the bear out toward Morrison. "He helps when I'm scared or sad. Maybe he could help you too." The silence that followed was profound. Prince William felt his throat tighten as he watched his son's spontaneous act of kindness. Morrison stared down at the small boy offering his most precious possession to a virtual stranger, and felt something inside his chest crack open. "That's very kind of you, Prince George," Morrison said softly, his formal training warring with the genuine emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "But I couldn't take your bear. You don't have to keep him forever," George explained with the simple logic of childhood. "Just until you feel better. Sometimes holding something soft helps when you're worried." Morrison knelt down slowly, bringing himself to George's eye level. This close, he could see the earnest concern in the boy's face, the genuine desire to help someone he sensed was in pain. It was a moment of pure human connection that transcended all the protocols and formalities that usually governed their interactions. "You're very perceptive, young prince," Morrison said quietly, "and very kind. You're going to make a wonderful king someday." "I don't want to be king yet," George replied matter-of-factly. "I just want people to not be sad." "Are you sad, Captain Morrison?" The direct question hung in the air between them. Morrison found himself facing a choice: maintain the professional distance he had always kept, or honor this child's unexpected compassion with honesty. Sometimes grown-ups have to face difficult things, Morrison said carefully. Today is my last day working at the castle. I'm going to miss everyone here very much, especially kind young princes who care about others. George's eyes widened with understanding. You're leaving? Forever. I am. But I'll never forget the wonderful family I've had the privilege to serve. Without hesitation, George stepped forward and hugged Captain Morrison, pressing the teddy bear between them. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuine, that Morrison felt tears spring to his eyes despite his best efforts to maintain his composure. Prince William watched this exchange with amazement and pride. His son had somehow intuited something that the adults around them had missed or chosen to ignore. The boy's natural empathy, his ability to see beyond the surface to the human being underneath, was both remarkable and deeply moving. Other staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual scene playing out in the courtyard. They watched in hushed silence as their distinguished colleague shared a moment of genuine human connection with the youngest member of the royal family. I'll keep Mr. Paddington safe, Morrison whispered to George, accepting the bear with hands that trembled slightly. And I promise to remember this kindness for the rest of my life. Will you tell Mr. Paddington stories about being a guard? George asked seriously. He likes stories about brave people. I will tell him many stories, Morrison promised, his voice thick with emotion. As they stood together in the morning sunlight, something beautiful happened. The formal boundaries that typically separated royal from servant, adult from child, seemed to dissolve. In their place was simply one human being reaching out to comfort another, guided by nothing more than genuine care and compassion. Prince William found himself thinking about his own childhood, about the lessons his mother had tried to teach him about seeing beyond titles and positions to the person underneath. Here was his son, barely 10 years old, embodying those lessons in a way that was both natural and profound. Captain Morrison has served our family with great honor for many years, Prince William said to his son, his voice carrying a new note of formality that signaled the importance of what he was about to say. His dedication and loyalty have been extraordinary. Then, why does he have to leave? George asked, still holding onto the guard's hand. Morrison looked up at Prince William, silently asking permission to share more. The prince nodded slightly, understanding that this moment called for more honesty than usual royal protocols might typically allow. Sometimes our bodies change as we get older, Morrison explained gently. I have an illness that means I won't be able to do my job as well as I once did. It wouldn't be fair to your family or to the people who depend on me to keep everyone safe. George considered this seriously, then asked, will the doctors help you get better? They'll help me manage my condition, Morrison said. But some things can't be fixed, they can only be lived with. That's part of life, Prince George. Learning to find joy and purpose even when things don't go the way we planned. The wisdom in those words struck Prince William forcefully. Here was a man facing an uncertain and difficult future, yet taking the time to share a life lesson with a child. It was exactly the kind of grace under pressure that had made Morrison such an exemplary guard for so many years. As if sensing the weight of the moment, the castle bells began to chime the hour. The sound echoed across the courtyard, marking not just the passage of time, but the end of an era. Morrison had heard those bells thousands of times during his service, but today they sounded different, more final. I should let you continue with your day, Morrison said, beginning to stand. But George wasn't finished. With the determined look that his father recognized as a sign that the boy had made up his mind about something, George reached up and did something that would be talked about in the palace for years to come. He snapped to attention and gave Captain Morrison the most serious, respectful salute his small body could manage. It wasn't perfect by military standards, but it was executed with such genuine reverence and intention that it carried more weight than 1,000 formal ceremonies. The gesture took Morrison's breath away. Here was a child, a future king, offering him the highest mark of respect in the only way he knew how. The salute was returned instinctively, Morrison's training taking over even as his heart swelled with emotion. Around them, the gathered staff members felt the power of what they were witnessing. Several dabbed at their eyes, moved by the simple beauty of the exchange. This was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they had chosen to serve, why the royal family continued to matter in a changing world. The salute lingered in the air between them, two figures frozen in a moment of mutual respect that transcended age, rank, and circumstance. Captain Morrison's eyes glistened as he maintained the formal position, honoring the gesture that Prince George had offered with such sincere intention. When they finally lowered their hands, the silence in the courtyard was complete. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself recognized the significance of what had just occurred. Morrison clutched the teddy bear against his chest, feeling the weight of the small gift that somehow contained more meaning than all the formal commendations he had received during his career. "Thank you, Prince George," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This has been the greatest honor of my service." Prince William placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, pride and emotion clear in his expression. "George, what you just did was extraordinary. Captain Morrison, your service to our family has been invaluable, and this farewell, well, it's something none of us will ever forget." As word spread through the castle about what had happened in the courtyard, staff members found excuses to walk past the main entrance. They wanted to witness the conclusion of Captain Morrison's final day, but, more than that, they wanted to see if the stories they were hearing could possibly be true. A 10-year-old prince giving up his beloved teddy bear and saluting a departing guard seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Margaret Morrison received a phone call from her husband's supervisor around mid-morning. Through tears of joy and amazement, she learned about her husband's extraordinary farewell. The supervisor's voice was thick with emotion as he described Prince George's gesture and the way it had moved everyone who witnessed it. "Your husband has always been special, Mrs. Morrison," the supervisor said. "But seeing how he touched that young prince's heart, how respected and loved he truly is, well, it's given all of us a new perspective on what real service looks like." At the palace, news of the morning's events reached senior staff and, eventually, the king himself. When Prince William shared the story with his father, emphasizing how naturally George had responded to Morrison's unspoken need for comfort, the king was deeply moved. "The boy has his great-grandmother's heart," the king said quietly, referring to the Queen Mother's legendary compassion for those who served the royal household, and his grandmother's eyes for seeing beyond the surface to the person underneath. As the day progressed, Captain Morrison completed his final duties with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there for weeks. The teddy bear remained with him, tucked safely in his uniform jacket, a tangible reminder of an unexpected moment of grace. Colleagues who spoke with him noticed a change in his demeanor. The quiet desperation had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. During his lunch break, Morrison sat alone in the guard's common room and carefully examined the small bear. It was clear that Prince George had loved this toy deeply. The fabric was soft from countless hugs, and there were tiny repairs where loving hands had mended small tears. This wasn't just any stuffed animal. This was a child's most treasured companion, given freely to comfort a stranger. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Princess Catherine, who had heard about the morning's events from Prince William. She found Captain Morrison at his post and approached him with the same grace and warmth that had endeared her to staff throughout the years. "Captain Morrison," she said, "I wanted to personally thank you for how you handled George's gesture this morning. William told me how gently you responded to our son's concern for you. That kind of patience and understanding is exactly what we hope for from the people who help shape our children's understanding of service and compassion." Morrison felt overwhelmed by her words. "Your Royal Highness," it was Prince George who showed extraordinary maturity and kindness. "I was simply honored to be the recipient of such generosity." Nevertheless, Princess Catherine continued, "Your response taught him that his instincts were correct, that reaching out to help someone in need is always the right choice. That's a lesson that will stay with him forever." As the afternoon wore on, Morrison found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't been able to since receiving his diagnosis. For weeks, he had focused solely on what he was losing: his career, his physical capabilities, his sense of purpose. But Prince George's simple gesture had reminded him of something crucial: the relationships he had built, the respect he had earned, and the example he had set would continue long after his uniform was hung up for the final time. The young guards under his supervision gathered around him during the shift change, wanting to hear the story directly from him. As Morrison recounted the morning's events, he watched their faces light up with amazement and respect. Several admitted that they had been worried about how to say goodbye, but seeing how Prince George had handled the situation gave them courage to express their own feelings. "You've taught us that service isn't just about following orders or maintaining traditions," said guard Tommy Walsh, who had joined the team just 2 years earlier. You've shown us that real service comes from caring about the people you're protecting, treating them as human beings worthy of your best efforts. That's what Prince George saw in you today, not just a guard doing his job, but someone who genuinely cares. As evening approached, Morrison prepared for his final walk through the castle corridors. This ritual had become sacred to him over the decades, a quiet time to ensure that everything was secure and peaceful before ending his day. Tonight, it carried additional weight as his farewell to a building that had been his second home for so many years. He paused at the portrait gallery, looking up at the painted faces of monarchs past and present. These people had been more than historical figures to him. They had been the embodiment of the ideals he had sworn to protect. The current royal family had proven themselves worthy inheritors of that legacy, and Prince George's actions that morning suggested the tradition of compassionate leadership would continue into the next generation. Margaret was waiting for him when he arrived home, her eyes bright with unshed tears of pride and love. She had prepared his favorite dinner and set out their best china, treating this last day of service with the ceremony it deserved. As they sat together at their small kitchen table, Morrison carefully placed Prince George's teddy bear in the center, between them. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, reaching across to touch his hand. "I want to hear every detail." As Morrison recounted the day's events, Margaret watched her husband's face transform. The burden of worry and sadness that had weighed on him for weeks seemed to lift as he spoke about Prince George's unexpected kindness and the way it had affected everyone who witnessed it. "You see," Margaret said when he finished, "you didn't just protect them all these years. You influenced them, helped shape them into the people they've become. That little prince learned something about leadership today by watching how you carried yourself even in difficult circumstances." The teddy bear sat between them as they talked late into the evening, sharing memories of Morrison's career and dreams for their future together. They spoke about traveling to places they had always wanted to see, about spending more time with their grandchildren, about finding new ways to contribute to their community. "I think," Morrison said as they prepared for bed, "that today taught me something important. The diagnosis doesn't have to be the end of who I am. It's just a new chapter, and maybe Prince George's bear will remind me that there's still kindness to be found, still purposes to be served, even when things don't go according to plan." The next morning brought letters from around the world. Somehow, word of Prince George's gesture had spread, and people were writing to share their own stories of small acts of kindness that had changed their lives. The palace staff, with the family's permission, forwarded these messages to Morrison, creating an unexpected bridge between his past service and his uncertain future. Prince George, meanwhile, spent the following days asking his father about Captain Morrison's condition and whether there was anything more they could do to help. The boy's persistent concern led to conversations about service, sacrifice, and the ways that ordinary people demonstrate extraordinary courage every day. 3 months later, Morrison received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. Prince George was hosting a small tea party for palace staff and their families, and specifically requested Morrison's attendance. The invitation, written in the boy's careful handwriting, included a postscript. "Please bring Mr. Paddington. I'd like to hear his stories about being brave." The tea party became an annual tradition, a way for Prince George to maintain connections with the people who had served his family and to continue learning about leadership through listening to their experiences. Morrison became a regular guest, sharing stories not just of palace life, but of facing challenges with dignity and finding purpose in unexpected places. Years later, when Prince George was older and facing his own challenges and responsibilities, he would often think back to that morning in the courtyard. He remembered the way Captain Morrison had accepted his teddy bear with such grace, how a simple gesture of kindness had created a moment of genuine human connection that transcended all the formal boundaries of their respective positions. The lesson stayed with him, that true leadership isn't about maintaining distance or authority, but about recognizing the humanity in others and responding with compassion when they need it most. It was a lesson learned not from books or formal instruction, but from watching a brave man face uncertainty with dignity and offering what comfort he could in return. Captain Morrison kept the teddy bear for the rest of his life, and it sat on his mantelpiece as a daily reminder that kindness is the most powerful force in the world, capable of transforming even the most difficult moments into something beautiful and meaningful. The small brown bear, with its button eyes and soft fur, became a symbol of hope and connection that bridged the space between a young prince and an aging guard. proving that the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers.